The morning of the audition began with a soft chill in the air, the kind that made people pull their jackets closer even though the sun was already rising. Outside the community music school, a small crowd had gathered. Parents talked quietly, trying to encourage their children, while the children themselves shifted from foot to foot, clutching folders or instrument cases with a mix of excitement and worry. The building wasn't fancy, but it had an old charm to it. The wide glass doors showed the lobby inside, where posters of past concerts lined the walls. Inside the hall, the director walked back and forth near the front desk. He liked to appear calm, but the staff knew he always had this restless way of moving before auditions began. He wore a simple dark suit, and his hair was neatly combed. Every now and then he made a light comment to the staff, trying to ease the tension before they officially opened the doors. Since he had seen hundreds of auditions over the years, he believed he could usually tell within a minute if someone had potential. The staff members were arranging papers on a long table, checking names, and making sure the list of students was in order. The director leaned on the counter for a moment, watching the children outside. Many of them looked prepared. Polished shoes, pressed clothes, confident expressions. A few looked nervous, and he felt a small wave of sympathy. Nervous students sometimes surprised him the most. The doors opened at exactly 9. The audition began with a rush of people entering the lobby at once. Parents guided their children toward the registration table, speaking in low voices, encouraging them to stay calm. The staff tried to handle everyone quickly, sending each student to the waiting area. The director gave polite nods to the crowd, keeping his tone warm so no one felt intimidated. In the middle of this busy movement, a small boy walked in with his mother. They didn't look like they had the same confidence as the others. The boy's clothes were clean but simple, a little worn. His shoes looked old, and he held a small notebook against his chest like it was something precious. His mother gently squeezed his shoulder as they approached the table. While the boy waited for his turn to register, a couple of other parents whispered quietly to one another. One shrugged in a way that wasn't cruel, but clearly doubtful. "Maybe he's just here to watch," someone murmured. The boy lowered his eyes, pretending not to hear. The director caught a portion of the whisper, though not the full sentence. He looked at the boy briefly, then gave a short laugh as he moved toward the stage area. "If he plays the piano," he said lightly to one of the staff members, "I'll kneel right here." It was meant as a harmless joke, something to ease the pressure of the morning, but the words carried more weight than he realized. The staff member smiled politely at the joke, though not fully sure how to respond. The comment wasn't meant to be cruel, but it still floated through the air like a small prediction. The boy didn't look like someone who would sit confidently in front of a piano. He seemed more like someone who wanted to disappear into the corner, someone who wished no one was looking at him. The mother filled out the form and thanked the staff softly. The boy stayed close to her, his fingers still gripping the little notebook. Once they finished checking in, they moved to the waiting area, where rows of chairs had been arranged in a straight line. Children sat quietly, some practicing finger movements or humming notes under their breath. Others appeared deep in thought. The boy sat down at the edge of a seat and kept his notebook open on his lap. Inside the notebook were pages filled with hand-drawn music notes, written neatly but with varying pressure, as if someone had guided him through each piece slowly and carefully. The pages were a little yellow at the corners. He touched them gently as if just flipping through the book helped steady his breathing. His mother leaned down and whispered, "Just do your best. That's all you need to do." The boy nodded, though the way he swallowed showed how nervous he was. Meanwhile, audition after audition began. Some children played strong, confident pieces that filled the hall with brightness. Others stumbled through their notes, cheeks turning red, but the director and staff still encouraged them politely. Each performance added to the rhythm of the day. From where the boy sat, he could hear bits of the music drifting through the half-open door that led to the main hall. Every time someone finished, a small burst of applause echoed through the building. The sound made him straighten up a little, as if trying to prepare himself for the moment when he would be called in. The director occasionally glanced at the list of names and tapped his pen against the clipboard. His earlier joke had already slipped from his mind as he focused on each student. He didn't realize the boy who held the notebook was listed further down the sheet. As time passed, the waiting area slowly emptied. Parents sat quietly behind their children, watching them rehearse silent finger movements. A few looked over at the little boy, noticing how still he was. Unlike the others, he didn't rehearse or hum. He simply stared at his notebook, breathing carefully. The mother tried to lighten his mood. "Do you remember the song you used to practice in the evenings?" she asked softly. "Just think of that one. You don't have to do anything more." The boy nodded again, but his eyes didn't move from the notebook. It wasn't fear of performing that held him still. It was the memory of the person who had taught him. Every page of the notebook reminded him of hours spent learning with someone who had encouraged him even when he doubted himself. The door to the audition room opened again. A staff member stepped out, calling the next student. The hallway filled with whispers as parents helped their children prepare. The boy felt his stomach tighten. He looked up, taking a deep breath, hoping his name wouldn't be next. Not yet. He wasn't ready. But a moment later, the staff member glanced at the list and called it. The boy looked at his mother. She squeezed his hand softly. "It's time," she whispered. He stood up slowly. His legs felt shaky, and the notebook he held suddenly felt heavier than before. As he walked toward the door, he heard one of the parents whisper softly, not cruelly, but out of curiosity, "Is he really going to play?" The boy's steps slowed for a moment, but he continued walking. He didn't look back. When he entered the hall, the lights seemed brighter than before. The stage felt larger, and the piano looked both welcoming and frightening. The director sat at a small table near the front, flipping through notes from the previous student. When he looked up, he didn't immediately connect this quiet boy with the joke he had made earlier. The boy stood in front of the piano, notebook in hand. The director offered a polite smile and asked gently, "Are you ready?" The boy nodded, though his voice didn't come out. He placed his notebook on the stand, opened it to the page he had memorized long ago, and carefully took a seat. For a moment, everything around him blurred. The director, the chairs, the bright lights. All he could feel were his fingers resting on the cool piano keys. The memory of his old neighbor's warm voice echoed quietly in his mind, telling him to breathe, telling him to trust himself. Outside the door, the waiting area had gone quiet. His mother listened closely, hoping to hear the first notes. A few parents paused their conversations, remembering the boy's shy posture and wondering how he would do. Inside, the boy closed his eyes. He took one more breath. Then he began to play. When the boy sat before the piano, the hall felt strangely quiet, as if the air itself was waiting to see what he would do. He kept his hands in his lap for a moment, breathing slowly. The director watched him with a calm but curious expression, still not fully aware of what this boy carried inside him. The small notebook rested on the stand, its worn edges giving a hint of how much it had been used. Before placing his fingers on the keys, the boy looked down at the page. The notes were handwritten, not printed, each symbol drawn carefully but imperfectly. They carried the personality of the person who had taught him, someone who had shaped his understanding of music in a gentle, patient way, someone he missed more than he could explain. The director noticed how the boy held the notebook with a certain protectiveness. He had seen many students rely on sheet music before, but something about the way this child touched the pages made him pause. It wasn't a usual kind of nervousness. It was deeper, tied to memories rather than fear of the audition. The director cleared his throat softly. "Take your time," he said, keeping his voice steady. He didn't want to rush him. The boy nodded once, still without speaking. His silence wasn't rude. It felt more like his voice was caught somewhere inside him, stuck behind emotions he hadn't sorted out. He finally lifted his hands and placed them gently on the keys. But instead of playing, he froze again. His mind drifted back to evenings that had shaped him. The soft glow of a lamp, the warm smile of a person who had believed in him, the slow lessons that had filled his heart with a quiet love for music. He could almost hear the voice again. "Don't rush. Let the music speak." The boy blinked and returned to the hall. He looked toward the doorway, where he knew his mother was waiting. She couldn't see him, but he imagined her standing close, hearing every faint sound. The director raised an eyebrow slightly. "Whenever you're ready," he said, trying to be encouraging. Still, the boy didn't play. His hands hovered over the keys. Not because he didn't know the notes. He knew them well, too well, in fact, because they reminded him of someone he wasn't ready to think about. A gentle memory surfaced. A simple house with a small living room. A worn-out piano that held countless stories. A kind person who sat beside him every evening, teaching him how to read notes, how to feel a melody, how to trust his hands even when he didn't trust himself. He remembered the laughter between wrong notes, the encouraging nods when he tried again, the calm voice saying, "You'll get it. Just breathe." That person had become like family. Someone he looked up to. Someone who saw something in him that he didn't see in himself. Then he remembered the day the lessons ended. The house had been quieter than usual. The piano sat untouched, and the warm smile he had come to know was gone. He didn't play for weeks after that. Every note felt like a painful echo. His mother had tried to comfort him, telling him that the person who taught him would have wanted him to keep playing. But grief made the keys feel heavier, like his fingers couldn't lift them. He looked at the director now, who seemed slightly confused by the silence. The boy wanted to explain, but the words didn't come easily. He looked at the notebook again, then finally spoke in a soft, fragile voice. "I learned this from someone close," he said, almost whispering. The director leaned forward slightly, catching the emotion hidden in those few words. "That's good," he replied gently. "Play it just the way they taught you." The simple kindness in the director's voice helped the boy steady his breath. Outside, his mother clasped her hands together, sensing what this moment meant for her son. She knew the story behind the notebook. She knew how many evenings he had spent practicing after school, how much joy those lessons had given him, and how painful it was for him when they suddenly stopped. She remembered the neighbor who had taken the boy under their wing. A warm-hearted person who found joy in teaching him, who noticed how the boy loved listening to the piano even before learning how to play. Someone who saw potential in his quiet nature. Someone who gave him a place to express himself. The boy wiped a small tear with the back of his hand before anyone could notice. The director saw the motion, but pretended not to. He understood grief well enough to know when to stay silent. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "Go ahead when you're ready." The boy inhaled deeply again. He let his fingers settle onto the keys, this time with more certainty. He looked at the handwritten notes, tracing them with his eyes like he was retracing memories. Finally, he pressed the first key. A soft, gentle sound filled the hall. It wasn't loud or bold. It was delicate, almost shy, like someone knocking softly on a door. The director felt something shift in the air. The boy continued. His hands moved slowly, gently, almost as if they were speaking a language only he understood. Each note carried a weight of emotion, unspoken, but deeply felt. He didn't play perfectly. A few notes were lighter than they should have been. A few transitions took a fraction of a second longer. But none of it mattered. The music had honesty in it, the kind that couldn't be faked. The boy wasn't playing to impress the director. He wasn't thinking about scholarships or applause. He was trying to honor someone he missed. Every note was a quiet thank you, another memory brought back to life. The director slowly lowered his pen and leaned back in his chair. This wasn't the performance he had expected from the shy boy with worn-out clothes and a trembling voice. There was something raw, something deeply human in the music. For a moment, he forgot about the joke he had made earlier. He forgot about the schedule, the evaluation sheets, the long list of students waiting. All he could do was listen. The boy's fingers moved with growing confidence, as though he was finally allowing himself to feel the music fully. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing became steadier. It was as if he had stepped into a safe space where he could simply exist. Outside, the hallway had become unusually quiet. Some parents glanced toward the doorway, sensing that something different was happening. The boy's mother held her breath, focusing on every faint sound. Inside the hall, the boy reached the middle of the piece. This was the part his neighbor used to emphasize, the heart of the song. The part that required feeling more than skill. His hands moved with emotion that surprised even him. The music rose gently, not loudly, but with a warmth that filled the room in a way few could ignore. The director felt the hair on his arms lift. He had heard many talented students over the years, but there was something unique about this. Something honest. Something painful and beautiful at the same time. It was the sound of a child carrying memories far beyond his age. The boy kept playing, letting the music guide him. He stopped thinking about the lights, the people, the expectations. He remembered evenings spent learning, the quiet encouragement, the soft laughter. When he reached the final part, his eyes glistened again. It was the same spot that always made his throat tighten because it reminded him of the very last lesson he ever had. Still, he played through it. He finished the piece with a soft, lingering note. As the sound slowly faded away, his hands remained on the keys a moment longer, as if he didn't want to break the connection. The hall stayed completely silent. The boy slowly lifted his hands. His breathing was slightly shaky again, but this time from emotion rather than fear. The director didn't speak right away. He simply stared at the boy, taken aback by the depth of what he had just heard. It wasn't technical brilliance that struck him. It was the feeling behind every note. It was the kind of performance that didn't come from training alone. It came from a story. The last note of the boy's song still floated in the air, almost too fragile to touch. For a moment, no one in the room moved. It felt as if the entire hall was holding its breath, not wanting to break the quiet moment he had created. The boy looked down at his hands, unsure if he had done well, or if he had made mistakes he hadn't noticed. The director sat quietly. His expression changed from curious to something more serious. He wasn't someone who usually showed emotion during auditions. Years of experience had taught him how to stay neutral, how to listen and then judge. But this time was different. Something about the way the boy played had reached him in a way he hadn't expected. The boy slowly turned his head and looked toward the side of the stage, where the soft light touched the edge of the piano. His heart still beat fast, but his fingers no longer trembled. Instead, they rested on his lap like they had finally released a weight he'd been carrying. Outside, in the hallway, the boy's mother stood still. She had been listening with her hands clasped together, her eyes watery. She could feel the emotion in every note, even if she didn't understand music the way others did. When the sound faded, she closed her eyes briefly, silently thanking the person who had taught her son, and hoping they would be proud of him. Inside the room, the director let out a slow breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He set his pen down, not because he didn't need it but because he couldn't think of anything to write just yet. He just watched the boy, who was sitting with his shoulders lowered in quiet relief. "You can relax," the director finally said gently. "You did well." The boy nodded slightly but didn't smile. His emotions were mixed: relief, sadness, gratitude, and exhaustion all blended into one. Playing that piece had taken courage he hadn't known he still had. The staff member standing in the corner also seemed touched. She had listened to hundreds of auditions over the years, but she could tell when something truly heartfelt happened. She had seen children with perfect posture and expert training. She had seen others who played beautifully but without emotion. But rarely did she see someone who seemed to pour their story into the piano the way this child had. The director cleared his throat quietly, trying to return to his usual professional manner, but it wasn't easy. He had made a light joke earlier, something he now regretted. He wished he had never said it, especially after hearing the boy play with such sincerity. He looked at the child again, noticing the worn edges of the notebook, the careful handwriting inside. It wasn't music from a teacher in a formal school. It was personal. It was something passed from one person to another with love. "Tell me," the director said softly, "how long have you been playing?" The boy hesitated. "A few years," he answered in a quiet voice. "Did you take lessons at a school?" the director asked. The boy shook his head. "No. Someone taught me at home." His voice softened at the last few words. The director didn't push further. He could hear the emotion in the boy's tone. It wasn't necessary to ask more. The director took a long breath and turned his gaze toward the piano. He had heard talented students, yet this one stood out for reasons he couldn't quite explain. There was a rawness in the boy's playing, a story behind the music that didn't need words. "Would you like to play another piece?" the director asked. The boy's eyes widened slightly, not out of fear but out of surprise. He had only prepared one piece, the one in the notebook. He wasn't sure he could play anything else as well. After a small pause, he shook his head. "I only brought this one," he said. "That's all right," the director replied with a small smile. "One was enough." The boy lowered his eyes, still unsure if the director meant that in a good way or not. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then the director reached for his notes again, not to write anything but as a way to gather his thoughts. "You can go now. Thank you for playing," he said gently. The boy stood up slowly, holding the notebook close to his chest. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect he had learned from his mentor. Then he turned toward the exit. The wooden door opened quietly as the boy stepped out into the hallway. His mother looked at him, searching his face for any sign of how it had gone. Her eyes softened when she saw him. She didn't need him to say anything. She could already sense it. "Did you do okay?" she whispered. The boy nodded. Not a big nod, just a small one. But she understood. She knelt slightly to be at his height and gently brushed his hair away from his forehead. "You did your best. That's all that matters," she said softly. The boy didn't speak. Instead, he held the notebook tighter. Around them, other parents and children waited for their own turns. Some looked at him curiously. Others looked away, focusing on their own preparation. But there was something different in the air now. A few of them had heard the faint sound of his playing, and even though they couldn't fully understand what had happened inside the room, they could feel a shift. Meanwhile, inside the hall, the director remained seated for a long moment after the boy left. He rubbed his forehead slowly, as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. He finally looked at the staff member nearby. "How old do you think he is?" he asked. "Maybe 10?" she guessed. The director nodded slowly. "And he plays with that much depth?" he said, mostly to himself. "Where did he learn to play like that?" The staff member shrugged gently. "Sometimes talent comes from unexpected places," she said. The director leaned back in his chair, thinking. He wondered what the boy's life was like. He wondered about the person who had taught him. Most of all, he wondered why a child so young carried such a heavy kind of music inside him. He looked again toward the door. He felt a sudden urge to call the boy back, to ask him more questions, but he held himself back. It wasn't the right moment. Instead, he let out another slow breath and picked up his pen. He wrote a single line on the evaluation sheet. "Remarkable feeling. Rare sincerity." It was the closest he could come to describing the performance. Back in the hallway, the boy and his mother moved to a small corner where they waited for further instructions. His mother sat beside him and placed her arm around him gently. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. The boy kept staring at the floor. "I hope he liked it," he said quietly. "He heard your heart in the music," she replied softly. "That's more important than anything else." The boy leaned into her for a moment. It wasn't often he showed such vulnerability, but the audition had stirred old emotions. Minutes passed. The hallway slowly filled with new sounds. Other children practicing, parents whispering advice, shoes tapping nervously against the tile floor. Life continued around them, but the boy felt like he had stepped out of time for a while. For him, the audition had not been just an audition. It had been a moment of facing something he had tried to avoid since his mentor passed away. Playing that piece again had reopened old memories, but it had also reminded him of the love he had been given. Eventually, a staff member walked out into the hallway with a clipboard. She called out the next group of students, her voice echoing off the walls. The boy sat quietly, listening. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he would get a scholarship, or if the director would remember him. But for the first time in a long while he felt lighter. He had played. He had honored the person who taught him. And the room had listened. The director, still seated in the audition room, stared at the piano. He remembered the joke he had made earlier and felt a small wave of regret. He now understood that the boy he had underestimated carried something extraordinary. He leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, "That child! He has something special." And he knew, without admitting it out loud yet, that this audition was going to stay with him long after the day ended. The moment the boy lifted his hands from the piano keys, the room felt heavier, as if the air itself needed a second to understand what had just happened. People blinked, exchanged quick glances, and sat up straighter in their chairs. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from confusion, but from something deeper, something that demanded attention. Even the director, who had joked earlier about kneeling if the boy actually played, didn't know what to say or how to react for a long moment. But the boy didn't look around to see their faces. He simply lowered his hands into his lap and kept his eyes down, as if unsure whether he had done something wrong. His shoulders rose and fell with one nervous breath. He looked like someone who had been taught to take up as little space as possible. The director finally stood, clearing his throat, trying to pretend he had been calm the whole time. But his face gave him away. He looked stunned. His eyes kept moving from the piano to the boy and back again, as if he needed proof that what he had just heard had actually happened. The assistant director leaned closer to him and whispered something, but the director shook his head, still lost in the moment. "No," he muttered quietly. "No, that wasn't normal. That wasn't just talent. That was something else." Someone at the back of the room shifted in their seat, breaking the silence. Another person whispered, "How old is he?" Someone else asked, "Where did he learn?" The boy didn't answer any of those questions. He wasn't even sure they were talking to him. His hands were still slightly trembling, and he pressed his fingertips together, grounding himself. It was clear he wasn't used to being the center of attention. Finally, the director walked toward him slowly, almost cautiously, as if approaching something fragile. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. The boy hesitated. "I learned at home," he said quietly. "At home?" the director repeated, surprised. "Who taught you? A teacher? Someone in your family?" He shook his head. "No teacher. I listened to old recordings. I tried to copy them." The assistant director leaned forward, stunned. "You learned by listening?" He nodded. Felt unbelievable. People spend years studying, learning techniques, practicing drills, repeating scales. But the boy had somehow reached a level that even trained musicians struggled to reach, and he had done it alone. The director looked back at the piano, then at the boy again. His earlier joke now felt embarrassing even to him. He rubbed the back of his neck and finally spoke. "Stand up." The boy obeyed, unsure of what was happening. The director waited for him to rise, then slowly lowered himself onto one knee. A gasp spread through the room. The assistant director covered his mouth, shocked. It wasn't dramatic or playful. It was sincere. "I'm a man of my word," the director said quietly. "I said I'd kneel, and after hearing that, I think I should have done more than kneel." The boy didn't know what to do. His eyes widened, his posture stiffened, and he looked down in embarrassment. He had never had anyone react to his music like this. His life had been filled with small rooms, old recordings, and the quiet clatter of keys under his fingers. But no one had ever knelt for him. No one had ever looked at him with awe. People in the room clapped softly at first, then louder, building into a warm wave of appreciation. Not forced, not polite, genuine. The director stood again and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Listen," he said gently, his tone calmer now. "I don't know what you're doing here today or who convinced you to come, but I'm glad you walked into this room. You have something special, something very few people ever have, and I want to understand it." The boy swallowed hard. "I just wanted a chance," he said. "Just one. And you earned it," the director said. "More than earned it." He motioned for everyone to sit. The tension in the room softened. The boy moved slightly away from the piano, but the director gestured for him to stay near it. "Sit," he said kindly. "You belong there." The boy sat again, this time more comfortably, though his heart was still racing. The assistant director opened a folder and pulled out a sheet. "We had planned a completely different order for this audition," she said. "But I think we need to start with him." Some of the others nodded. One person whispered, "This changes everything." The director leaned against the piano, looking at the boy thoughtfully. "I want to hear something else," he said. "Not a performance piece. Just," he searched for the right words, "something that shows who you are." The boy hesitated. "I don't know what to play." "Something you made," the director said softly. The boy looked startled. "I've never played anything of my own in front of people." "There's a first time for everything," the director encouraged. "And if what we heard earlier is any sign, your ideas might be even more powerful than any piece you've learned from someone else." The boy looked down at the keys. For a long moment he didn't move. Everyone waited. The room held its breath again. He touched the keys lightly, testing the sound, letting the vibrations guide him. Then he began to play. Not a full piece. Not something structured or rehearsed. Just a quiet melody that flowed from somewhere deep inside him. It was different from the earlier piece. Softer. More fragile. As he played, he wasn't copying or imitating anything he had heard. He was speaking. His music was like a story without words. Uncertain at times, hopeful at others. Every note felt honest. People listened closely. Some leaned forward. Some closed their eyes. Even the director looked emotional, his expression warm and thoughtful. When the melody faded, the boy lifted his hands slowly, almost as if pulling himself out of a dream. The room remained silent, but not from shock this time. It was the kind of silence that comes from experiencing something real and gentle. The director didn't clap. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked over to the piano bench, crouched down to meet the boy's eyes, and spoke softly. "I want to help you," he said. "Not because of what you can do for us, but because of who you already are." The boy's eyes filled slightly, though he blinked quickly to keep anything from falling. "I don't want to misunderstand," the director continued. "Are you ready to learn? To grow? To show the world what you have inside you?" The boy took a deep breath. "Yes," he whispered. "Good," the director said. "Because this is just the beginning." People in the room exchanged looks. Some excited, some curious, some already imagining what the future could look like for him. The assistant director stepped forward and handed the boy a form. "This is for the next stage," she said kindly. "Fill it out when you're ready. No rush." The boy stared at the paper, unsure whether to smile or cry. He had come into the room with nothing, not even confidence. And now he was being offered something he had never expected. A real chance. As he stood up from the piano and held the form in his hand, he felt different. Not bigger, not louder, just seen. And that was the turning point. Not just for the audition. Not just for the director. But for him. After that moment, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The boy walked out of the audition hall holding the form tightly in his hand, as if it were something fragile that might fly away if he didn't grip it hard enough. Outside, the air felt cooler, calmer, different from the intense silence that had filled the room moments before. His steps were slow, not because he didn't know where to go, but because he wanted to understand what had just happened. For so long, he had believed that talent was something hidden, something he had to protect. He had grown up thinking that his music belonged only to small spaces and quiet moments, not big rooms with bright lights and strangers whose eyes followed every move he made. But now everything felt different. Someone had finally listened. Someone had believed in him. As he reached the hallway, he heard footsteps behind him. One of the assistants from the audition rushed toward him, slightly out of breath. "Wait a moment," she called gently. He paused and turned around. She smiled warmly, the kind of smile that wasn't forced or polite, but honest. "I just wanted to tell you something," she said. "Not as part of the team, but as someone who watched today. You changed the room. You really did." The boy lowered his eyes shyly. "I just played." No, she said softly. You shared something. There's a big difference. He didn't know how to respond. Praise was something he still didn't know how to hold. She nodded at the form in his hand. Fill that out soon. They're serious about taking you to the next stage. And I think you're ready for it. He thanked her quietly, then walked outside into the open courtyard. The sky was a pale shade of evening blue, and a thin breeze brushed against his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt lighter, as if a quiet hope inside him had finally learned to breathe. He sat on a bench near the entrance and unfolded the form. The paper had several sections: information, background, future goals. He stared at the blank spaces, unsure what to write in half of them. How could he explain his past? How could he describe the years of practicing on an old, uneven keyboard, listening to cracked recordings, teaching himself each note by ear because there was no teacher to guide him? He hesitated with the pen in his hand. A few people walked past him, chatting casually, unaware of his quiet battle with the form. He wasn't afraid of the opportunity. He was afraid of saying something wrong and losing his chance before it even began. He took a deep breath and began writing the simple truth because that was all he had. He wrote about how he learned by listening. He wrote about the nights when he stayed awake long after everyone else had gone to sleep, practicing the same passage over and over until it finally sounded right. He wrote about wanting to learn properly, wanting guidance, wanting a path. Each word he wrote felt like a small weight lifting from his chest. When he finished, he folded the paper again and held it close. He wasn't sure if it was perfect, but he knew it was honest. As he stood up to return inside, he heard a soft voice behind him. Done already? He turned to see the director walking toward him. The director's expression was different now. Less serious, more open, as if the weight he had carried earlier had shifted. The boy nodded. I think so. The director reached out and gently took the form. Thank you, he said. I know this was a big day for you. The boy swallowed. I didn't expect any of it. Life is strange like that, the director replied with a slight smile. Sometimes it gives you what you never thought you'd have, right when you need it most. They walked together toward the building, though neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't tense or awkward. It was comfortable, like two people moving through a moment they both understood. Inside, the assistant director greeted them. We've already talked about the next steps, she said. We're inviting you to a special session this weekend. A smaller group, more focused. You'll get a chance to learn from some very experienced musicians. The boy blinked. Me? Yes, you, she said warmly. You didn't think we'd let you disappear after today, did you? He didn't know how to respond. His heart felt full, almost overwhelmed. The director placed a hand on his shoulder. It's not going to be easy, he said. You'll have to work harder than you ever have. But you're not alone anymore. We'll guide you. The boy nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He had lived most of his life feeling unseen, unheard, unnoticed. But now, people not only heard him, they wanted to help him grow. After saying their goodbyes for the day, the boy walked home with steps that felt different from before. The city around him seemed brighter. Every sound echoed differently, clearer, fuller, as if the world had shifted slightly. He replayed the director's words in his mind, over and over. You're not alone anymore. When he reached home, he placed the folded form on his small desk and sat beside it. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow from the window. His old keyboard sat in the corner, the keys slightly worn from years of use. He walked over to it, touched the faded surface and sat down. He pressed a single key lightly. The sound was imperfect, a little dull, nothing like the grand piano he had played earlier. But it was familiar. It was the place where everything started. Closing his eyes, he played the same soft melody he had created in the audition room. The one that came from somewhere deep inside him. This time it felt different, stronger, clearer, filled with something new. Hope. The melody drifted through the small room like a quiet promise. A promise that he was stepping into a new chapter, not because everything would suddenly be easy, but because he finally had a path to follow. He thought of the weekend session, the new faces, the new lessons, the challenges waiting for him. Fear tried to creep in, but excitement chased it away. When he finished playing, he opened his eyes slowly. The room felt warmer now, as if his music had changed the air itself. He looked at his keyboard and smiled gently. Not because it was perfect, but because it had given him something that no one else could have. A beginning. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual. He didn't feel tired, even though he had slept late. Something inside him was pushing him forward. He prepared himself, checked the form once again, and headed out. The sun was rising, painting the sky with soft colors. As he walked through the quiet streets, he felt a new rhythm in his steps, a silent energy that he couldn't quite describe. When he reached the building, the director and assistant director were already there. They greeted him not as someone auditioning, but as someone joining. And that made all the difference. The weekend session was intense. The room was filled with people who had years of training, people who already knew the language of music in ways he didn't. But every time he felt lost, someone guided him. Every time he doubted himself, someone encouraged him. The director watched closely, offering gentle correction when needed, but more importantly, offering belief. At the end of the session, one of the senior musicians approached him and said, "You have a long road ahead, but you have something real. Don't lose it." The boy nodded. "I won't." Walking home after the session, he felt tired but happy, genuinely happy. For the first time in his life, he knew where he belonged. He wasn't just a boy playing in a quiet room anymore. He wasn't someone hoping for a chance. He had a beginning, a real one, and the world would hear him, not because he was loud, but because his music carried something true. That day, as he walked through the fading light, he realized something important. Sometimes a single moment, a single performance, a single act of courage can change everything. And his moment had just begun.